Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into the muddy clearings of medieval Europe, where peasants did not have power tools or pre-cut lumber, but relied on sheer muscle and shared knowledge to raise their homes. Forget the elegant manor houses and stone castles you see in grand tales. The real story is about chopping trees by hand, hauling logs behind oxen, and wrestling wattle and daub into place under the sun. So tonight we ask what it truly took to build a peasant cottage from scratch. What did it feel like to hoist a roof beam on weary shoulders, knowing a single mistake could bring the whole structure crashing down? Every village had its own method, so let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see who's joining this journey into the timberline and the thatched roofs. Now, dim the lights, pull your blanket close, and let's step into the clearing. Together, you step into the forest's edge just as dawn's light filters through budding leaves. Before you lies a clearing of tangled underbrush and small saplings. The task at hand is to find the perfect spot for erecting your future home. In this age, there are no surveyors or modern tools. The criteria are simple yet vital. First, the ground must be relatively level to prevent rainwater from collecting beneath the floor and rotting the timbers. Second, you need to be close enough to the forest for timber, but not so deep that wolves and bears roam frequently. Third, a water source must be at hand for drinking, cooking, and tending livestock, but not so near that flooding could strike during the spring thaw. For days you walk the boundary between trees and open land. Your feet sink into damp moss or tighten over rocky soil. You consider a slope that faces east to catch the morning sun, but set it aside because the incline is too steep for heavy beams. You pass a small stream fed by a mountain spring. Its banks are flanked by alder and willow. The water runs clear and cold. You test the flow by scooping water into your palm and tasting it. Indeed, it will serve well for drinking and for washing hides when you begin tanning. Yet this stream floods during heavy rains. You have seen the floods rush down after spring thaw too quickly and sweep away small fingerlings of fish. Making a home too near its banks would be risky. A day later, you find a spot where the forest thins and sunlight warms the mossy floor. The ground here rises slightly toward a gentle hillock. You inspect tree rings on a felled oak nearby, noting that the oldest trees stand just beyond the edge. Those are the trees to cut for support. Posts, since oak root systems can withstand moisture. The small firs and birches around are ideal for weaving into wattle later. You notice a patch of wild strawberries growing nearby. Their presence tells you that the soil is rich enough to support crops when you clear more land later. You put down your pack and squat to examine the ground. The soil yields to your fingers without hard resistance and drains water well. You dig a small finger into the earth and find a layer of gravel beneath the topsoil. That gravel will function as a natural drain, preventing water from pooling beneath the floor beams. You chip at small stones to confirm the layer runs through. Encouraged, you rise and survey the horizon. In the distance, you recall wolves howling nights ago. Yet this place sits far enough from their dens. You decide that this clearing meets the criteria. At midday, you place a marker, carved from a piece of birch wood, into the center of the clearing. This will serve as the heart of the future dwelling. You face east and align the marker so that you will live in harmony with the rising sun. This orientation also allows wind to blow through the gable ends, later reducing smoke drift when you build a hearth. After marking the spot, you gather a handful of grass, rolling it into a loose fist and letting seeds scatter. You hope that grass will take hold around your foundation and prevent soil erosion when the rains come. Now begins the work of clearing. With a small hand axe, you chop away saplings and brush. Each stump you cut will be used for firewood and to craft stakes later when you raise the walls. You warn a neighbor who arrives at your signal. Together you carry fallen saplings to the edge of the clearing, stacking brush to be burned when the pile is dry. Smoke from that fire will deter insects and drive away small creatures that might burrow near the foundation. You notice a doe stepping through the underbrush beyond the clearing size. Her presence reminds you that wildlife still roams these parts. You resolve to leave a small copse of trees on the northern edge to offer shelter to birds and small game. This abundance will feed children and supplement grain when you begin planting. Over the next 3 days, you and your neighbor muscle logs and clear thorny brambles. Without oxen, the heaviest logs are dragged on a crude sled fashioned from bent sapling boughs and bundled undergrowth. Each log wears deep grooves where bark has stripped away. Yet every piece will serve as a pillar or rafter in the future structure. You step carefully after the logs to avoid tripping over half-buried roots. One day you slip and twist your ankle. Your neighbor helps you hobble back to a makeshift camp of moss and furs. By evening, you have bound your ankle with strips of linen and twisted herbal poultice from yarrow and plantain. Rested, you return the next day to continue clearing. At the close of the 5th day, the area measures about 15 paces by 20 paces, ample for a modest cottage with space for an attached shed. The ground is free of rocks large enough to impede beams. You inspect the perimeter and find no treacherous stumps that might pierce the floor. Only a few small depressions where animal tunnels once lay still remain. You fill those with loosened earth so the surface remains even. Chickweed and clover now poke from the soft soil, promising a fresh layer of grass in weeks. You gather seeds from the nearby patch, while your neighbor prunes thistles and nettles that rise near the clearing's edge. As dusk approaches, you sit back and rest on a felled log, surveying the clearing. The setting sun bathes the area in golden light. Birds settle into the remaining pines, and an owl hoots from a distant trunk. In that quiet, you sense a deep connection between the work of your hands and the land beneath your boots. This place once brimmed with wild growth, and now stands transformed by intent. You envision the future cottage rising, a skeleton of upright posts and cross beams reaching skyward. You picture walls of woven stick plastered with clay and straw, a hearth in the center, and smoke curling through a simple flue. You imagine children laughing in the doorway, and fowls scratching at feed scattered near the edge. That night, you and your neighbor share a simple meal of roasted rabbit and barley bread beneath a small fire. The sky above clears and stars puncture the velvet black. You speak of the days ahead, felling larger trees, hauling timber, and raising beams at midsummer when the rains recede. You know that this weekend's work has laid the foundation not only for a home but for a life rooted in community and self-reliance. In the darkness beyond the clearing, you hear the murmur of stream water and scent seal of wildlife returning to newly trimmed woods. In that symphony of nature and human effort, you find comfort that soon a cottage will stand here, a testament to peasant ingenuity and enduring spirit. After clearing away saplings and cutting down small trees, you turn to the stumps that remain embedded in the earth. Each stump must be removed whole or cut low enough to prevent future snags beneath the floor beams. With a broad axe, you chop around the stump's base, severing the lateral roots that cling to the soil. The axe yields slowly as you rotate your body, using all of the strength in your arms and back. Each swing sends shavings flying, revealing thicker roots that clamp like iron bands. You continue until a trench encircles the stump, and then insert a sturdy wooden lever beneath the remaining root mass. You push down hard with both feet, feeling the lever pry the stump free. When the stump breaks loose with a heavy crack, you heave it clear and toss it aside. Its roots drag through the earth, leaving a shallow divot where water once pooled after rains. You fill the depression with loose soil and pack it with your boots until the ground feels level underfoot. Next, you move to another stump that lies nearer the center of the clearing. It is larger and its root system extends wider. You chop away rings of wood in a spiral until the stump stands just above the surface. Several neighbors arrive with wedges of sharpened oak and sledgehammers. You insert the wedges into cracks at the stump's perimeter, and take up a sledgehammer to pound each wedge until the stump splits in two. Splinters fly, and dust rises into the morning air. You repeat until the stump breaks into manageable pieces. You heave the largest fragments to the edge of the clearing and toss smaller bits into a nearby fire pit meant for burning debris. As smoke curls skyward, you notice a faint scent of sap burning. It warms your bones in the crisp air. Once all visible stumps are hewn away, you inspect the ground for smaller roots that might rise. Up beneath the floor beams, you trace your fingers along the soil, feeling for resistances. When you detect fibrous strands, you dig a narrow trench with a spade, loosening the earth until the root can be pulled out by hand. You gather a bundle of these last roots and toss them into the same fire pit. With the undergrowth and stumps removed, the clearing now lies nearly smooth. You kneel and draw a circle in the dirt, marking the future corner of the floor. Around it you trace a line for the first post, ensuring it lies a pace from each edge so that walls will align properly. Later, you take a length of chalk from your pack and draw straight lines connecting each corner marker, forming a rough rectangle that will become the cottage's footprint. Sunday rises higher as you begin to level minor undulations in the terrain. Using a long plank and a rock, you create a primitive level. One end sits on the stone, and you adjust the plank's angle until a small bead of water on its surface holds steady without rolling. You mark the highest points where the plank sits unevenly. A neighbor arrives with a mattock and begins chipping away raised ground to lower it to match the rest. Each clod of earth that crumbles is hauled to a low spot where a shallow puddle still lingers. You fill the puddle with loose soil until you see no depression beneath your boot. You move to the next high spot, repeating the process. By midday, the clearing stands flat and true. No puddles remain and no mound interrupts the surface. The rectangle you traced grows more defined with each adjustment. You inspect each corner once more, sighting along the lines to ensure they form right angles. You ask a neighbor to hold the plank level at one corner while you sight from the opposite marker. The sight line runs true. You nod in satisfaction and wipe sweat from your brow. Shifting focus, you dig a shallow drainage ditch around the perimeter. The trench sits 6 hands deep and 2 hands wide. Its purpose is to divert rainwater around the cottage rather than allow it to seep beneath the foundation. You push the spade into soft earth near the rectangle's edge, levering soil out in clods. As each shovelful rises, you pile it alongside the trench to form a low bank. When rain comes, the water will flow down the bank into the ditch and away from the house. This measure will help preserve the floor beams from rot in seasons to come. Once the ditch runs continuous all around you, scatter gravel over its base. You gathered gravel from a nearby stream when you first inspected the site. While wading in shallow water, you felt smooth stones tumble across your boots. You collected fist-sized stones in a woven basket. Now you lay them in the trench, spacing each to allow silt to settle between. These stones will form a barrier that prevents the ditch from collapsing under heavy rain, and the water will slip through without carrying away soil. You finish by pressing wider stones against the trench's edges to reinforce the bank. Next, you mark spots for the main support posts. Using a length of rope and 2 stakes, you form an X across the rectangle's center. Where the ropes cross marks the central post that will bear much of the roof's weight. You dig a hole at this spot to test the earth's firmness. You push a length of wood into it to measure depth before inserting a post. The wood plunges into damp soil until it strikes a denser layer of clay and gravel 10 hands down. You determine that this layer will serve as a stable footing. You refill the hole, scattering loose soil over it to preserve its condition until you place the post beam when the frame is ready. With post holes tested, you next consider the orientation of the cottage. You stand at the southwest corner and face the rectangle's center. You note that winds often come from the northwest. If the main doorway sits on the southeast side, it will avoid direct gusts. You circle the rectangle, visualizing each opening. Early morning sun will shine through east-facing windows, warming the interior on cold days. Afternoon shade from nearby evergreens will keep heat at bay during summer months. You nod in approval and use the chalk again to mark the doorway location on the southeast side. At dusk, you gather around a small fire with neighbors who came to assist. Someone fetches pots of pottage cooked over a separate cooking fire. Each spoonful brims with barley and vegetables grown in community gardens. You share tales of earlier generations building similar cottages by hand. Their stories carry laughter and regret. One elder recalls helping his father fill trenches with stones after floods washed away a frame. Another recounts how a recent drought shrank streams, forcing villagers to haul water from miles away. You nod as you sip thick gruel, knowing your decisions today on drainage and orientation may spare future hardship. As night settles, you light a lantern and survey the clearing by its gentle glow. The rectangle lies ready, free of stumps and rocks. You envision the labor ahead, felling oak for beams and crafting mortise and tenon joints at the shaded north edge before raising the frame at dawn. Around you, the forest stands silent, ancient trees shifting in a cool breeze. Each breath carries pine resin and night dew. You place a hand on a stake marking the future doorway. You sense that families yet unborn will gather within these walls for meals and shelter. You extinguish the lantern and return to the small camp where your tent waits. The sounds of owls echo above, and small creatures scurry between roots. You slip into a bed of furs and settle your head upon a folded cloak. Exhaustion claims you quickly. As sleep descends, you dream of timber arcs rising floor beams, standing tall, and walls of wattle and daub sealing out wind and rain. The clearing lies quiet until sunrise when the next stage of building begins. In that moment, you rest assured that site selection and preparation have laid a sturdy foundation for the cottage to come. Before dawn, you step from your cottage, the air cool and dew-laden, and you make your way to the western edge of the wood. Here, ancient oaks and sturdy ash trees rise skyward, their limbs reaching toward the light. These are the trees you must fell to build your home. In your hands, you carry a broad axe, its bit sharpened against a whetstone just days before. A whetstone is simple yet essential, a flat slab of sandstone that you pour water over until the surface glistens. Pressing the axe blade against the stone at a careful angle, you push and pull until the metal edge becomes sharp enough to bite into wood. Each stroke of the axe on the whetstone throws off tiny metal shavings and fills the air with the sound of grinding steel on stone. When the edge gleams under the morning light, you know you are ready. You choose an oak whose trunk measures wide at the base and stands straight. A neighbor stands by to help, holding a long wooden wedge and a heavy sledgehammer. Together, you inspect the tree to decide the direction in which it will fall. You need a clearing that allows the tree to lie flat without damaging other trees or blocking the trail back to the homestead. Your neighbor marks a spot on the trunk with chalk made from ground limestone mixed with water. This mark indicates where the final blow will guide the tree to the ground. Placing your feet firmly on either side of the trunk, you raise the axe above your shoulder. With strength drawn from both arms and torso, you bring the axe down onto the tree's bark. The blade sinks into the oak, biting deep with a harsh crack. You repeat, swinging slowly yet powerfully to cut a notch about an arm's length high into the side of the tree facing the clearing. With each bite, the wood chips scatter in arcs, piling at your feet like pale snow. The hollow echoes of each strike fill the forest, startling birds from nearby branches. You pause only to wipe sweat from your brow and test the blade's edge again on your whetstone, knowing that a dull tool would create extra work and risk a misstep. When the notch is deep enough to reveal the heartwood, You step around to the opposite side to begin your back cut. Your neighbor positions the wooden wedge into a split in the trunk. You chop above the wedge, forcing the wood fibers to open. The wedge shifts as the grain separates, and you hammer it deeper until the tree trembles. Dust and pollen swirl in the faint morning breeze. The sound of cracking wood fills the clearing. Finally, the trunk begins to tilt, then swings broadly and crashes to the ground, sending up a cloud of earth and leaves. You and your neighbor step back, hearts pounding, as the massive trunk thuds into the clearing. With the tree down, you rest a while to catch your breath and inspect the loser. No branches lie tangled with other trees, and the fallen trunk rests safely on the ground. Your neighbor offers a piece of coarse bread and a swig of spring water. You take a moment to admire the oak's rings, each marking a year of growth and weather. You whisper a silent thanks for the gift of wood that will shelter your family through coming seasons. Next, you prepare to split the trunk into manageable lengths. You sharpen the axe once more with the whetstone, checking the edge by drawing a finger lightly along the blade's face. A clean catch confirms the sharpness. You climb onto the down trunk and use the axe to cut the oak into segments about 10 feet long, each marked for splitting into beams and posts. You swing carefully, ensuring the blade bites squarely into the wood without deflection. When each segment falls free, it lands with a heavy thud, echoing across the forest floor. Now comes the work of splitting each segment into usable logs. You set a segment upright on a sturdy stump that serves as a chopping block. You choose an ash tree log for this first split. The ash wood lighter, yet strong enough to form interior beams. Placing the axe at the base of the ash, you strike with precision. The blade sinks into the grain, and you follow with the wooden wedge, driving it in with the sledgehammer that your neighbor holds. With each blow, the wedge forces the wood to part along its natural lines. Splinters fly and the log splits in two. You repeat, placing additional wedges in each split until the log divides into 4 roughly equal sections. These sections will become posts and floor timbers. You continue this process for each 10-foot segment of oak and ash. The harder oak requires repeated strikes and multiple wedges to split fully. Each time you remove a weighty piece, you feel the muscle ache deep in your back and arms. Sweat soaks through your woolen tunic as you labor under the sun's growing heat. Neighbors pause in their fields to offer water and words of encouragement. Children watch from a distance, wide-eyed at the display of strength and skill. When a smaller child approaches you, hand over a small piece of white oak, explaining how it can be used to make wooden pegs that will fasten beams together. The child runs off, proud to carry such a treasure for the future craft work. As midday approaches, you measure each split log. Oak pieces that measure 6 hands across serve as posts. Those about 4 hands across become floor joists. Shrub-sized pieces become rafters once shaped. The lighter ash sections will form the inner frame. You gather a group of the properly sized logs and designate a space near the edge of the clearing for drying. Fresh wood holds moisture and can split or warp if built into the structure too soon. In medieval times, peasants often allowed logs to rest for months until the sap dried and the wood became stable. With the logs stacked and supported by smaller sticks to hold them off the ground, you leave them to season under sun and breeze. Now you turn to hauling logs to the home site. Without horses or oxen, your neighbors help you drag them using a simple wooden sled. You position the sled at the base of a log, slipping a rope under the log and over the sled's curved nose. 2 sturdy poles on either side brace the log so it will not roll off. Neighbors grip the wooden yoke behind the sled and brace their shoulders, each applying steady pressure to move the load. At first, the sled snags on roots and lumps of earth. You guide your friends to shift the weight, lifting the sled's front end, so that superior leverage allows it to glide. Step by step, you inch the sled through the clearing and onto a beaten track that leads back toward the home site. The track is beaten from many feet walking back and forth. You instruct the neighbors to avoid ruts that could impede progress and to call when they need to reset the log on the sled if its weight shifts. After a half day of hauling, 2 logs reach their destination by the cleared site where you will lay the beams. You relay a simple cheer and clap shoulders as you prepare the logs for the next stage. Each log rests on short stumps tapped level with a mallet so that they sit square and await hoisting. You inspect the logs again, checking for straightness and ensuring no hidden knots will cause problems when raising the frame. You mark each with chalk to indicate which part will face outward, ensuring the proper grain orientation so that wind and water run naturally across the surface. As the sun begins its descent, you return to the forest edge to select smaller saplings for rafters. These trees do not need to be as large as the posts, but must grow straight to distribute the roof's weight evenly. You identify slender pines and firs among standing trees. Striking a careful blow with the axe, you fell each in a controlled direction toward the clearing to minimize waste and ensure safety. Each sapling fells with a whine as it bends and finally splinters at its base. You measure each for length and diameter, aiming for pieces that taper from foot to tip to form the roof's pitch. Back at the clearing, you sharpen the axe one final time as the even light fades. You and your neighbors split some of these saplings lengthwise where larger beams bend to form roof supports. You work with wedges and sledgehammers until each sits ready. As glowworms appear in the underbrush, you stack logs by size near the outline of the cottage. Later, you will gather cord and leather straps to tie beams together when raising the frame. When darkness descends, you build a small cooking fire at the edge of the clearing. You roast a simple meal of dried venison and leeks. Around the fire, your friends share ale from a wooden barrel that leaks slow but steady. Between mouthfuls, you discuss tomorrow's work, hauling the heaviest oak posts into holes you will dig at first light and shaping the mortise and tenon joints that will join each section. Your neighbor mentions that a traveling carpenter arrived in a nearby village and offered to teach new techniques for joining beams. You note that you will send for him after you raise the frame so he can guide you in crafting a sturdy roof. When the meal ends, you extinguish the fire and settle into a shared blanket of furs, the scent of pine resin lingering as night closes in. Beneath a canopy of stars, you hear distant calls of night owls and the soft rustle of leaves. You gaze at the logs stacked near the clearing edge, each representing days of backbreaking work. You think of the weeks ahead, drawing the frame skyward, thatching the roof, and constructing walls to protect your family from winter's chill. You feel the satisfaction of progress, tempered by the knowledge that each step demands more effort. As you drift toward sleep, you recall the rhythms of the day, the kiss of axe on oak and ash, the sweat on your brow as you split logs with wedge and mallet, and the songs sung by neighbors as they pulled sleds through mud and moss. You imagine how each log will join its companion to form a shelter, where you will share bread and laughter under a roof of straw. In that moment of quiet beneath the stars, you find a measure of peace, knowing that tomorrow the labor will resume, but that each swing of the axe brings you closer to a home built by your own hands. When the final timbers lie split and ready, your focus turns to hauling them from the forest to the building site. Without horses or oxen, your neighbors jury-rig simple wooden sleds. These sleds consist of 2 long parallel runners cut from straight ash logs. Across these runners, you lay crossbeams carved from sturdy oak. These beams bind the runners together and support the weight of each timber. Assembly takes time. First, you strip bark from the ash logs with a draw knife until their surfaces run smooth. Then you notch notches for the crossbeams using a chisel and mallet. Each notch fits snugly over the beam, preventing wobble when you pull the sled over rough ground. You secure beams in place with wooden pegs driven through holes made with an awl. Even in this crude form, the sled holds together, bearing heavy loads as you work. With 2 sleds ready, you select the first log to haul. This log, an oak beam split earlier, measures nearly 10 feet, and weighs more than you can easily lift. A neighbor and you slide it close to the sled runners, careful to keep the log level. You tie the log to the sled with thick lengths of leather thongs. You wrap the thongs around the log and runners several times and then secure the ends with a simple knot that will not slip. With the log secured, you step aside as a group of neighbors forms around the sled. A yoke fashioned from oak lies across the shoulders of two strong men who stand at the front of each sled. Behind them, 3 others grasp the ends of a thick rope tied to the front beam. Each man clamps both hands around the rope, bracing feet wide to share the load. One neighbor rests his hands on the sled's back beam to guide and keep it level. At your word, the pulling begins, with a rock lodged behind each runner so the sled will not slide prematurely. The men push the rock aside and lean forward, shoulders square. The sled shudders and then moves slowly. At first, the runners scrape against undergrowth and small stones. You and a neighbor stand to either side, using long poles to lever away saplings and small roots. With each step, the sled inches forward, cresting small ridges where fallen branches once lay. You encourage the pullers, calling out a steady pace. Their faces shine with sweat, as each meter of progress requires gritted teeth and muscles straining at the rope. After several yards, the oak beam shifts against its bindings. You step forward, loosening the leather thongs with a small knife and then rewrapping them more tightly. You wrap them so that loops form around the runners in a figure-8 pattern. This extra care prevents the beam from rolling off the sled as you move through uneven ground. Neighbors gather to steady the beam until you clamp the final knot. With the log secure once more, you return to your position behind the men as they resume pulling. The path to the building site spans 30 rods through mixed terrain of packed earth, shallow, ditches, and scattered stones. You know that direct routes can become impassable after rains, so you guide the workers along a low ridge that runs from the forest edge to the clearing. The ridge offers firmer ground and avoids muddy ravines where trapped workers might struggle. As you near a section where the ground dips, you have the men pause. You instruct them to lower one runner into a shallow trench you dig with a spade. The other runner sits on firmer ground. When you call out, they heave together and the sled tilts until both runners rest evenly. The log moves smoothly now, no longer wobbling as it did over undulating surfaces. You clap your hands and shout encouragement, spurring the pullers through the final stretch. At midday, you reach the clearing where earlier you prepared foundations. The log sits heavy on the runners as the men pull it into position. You draw chalk lines on the ground to mark where each log will sit once raised. Each log must rest precisely on its base to ensure walls stand straight. You guide the men to tilt the sled. Then you slip a wooden block beneath the log's end to level it with the foundation markers. Others lift the front end of the log and roll it off the runners onto prepared oak posts placed in holes. Once the beam sits in its final position, you remove the sled and move it back to the forest for the next load. Before returning for more logs, you pause to eat a simple meal of hardtack and cheese you carried in a satchel. You share chunks of bread with neighbors who fan themselves with branches. You sip water from a hollowed gourd. You remind yourself that building a cottage demands both physical strength and careful planning. Each trip back and forth strains the body, but you also know that hauling logs in smaller loads risks leaving beams too heavy to move once they sit in place. Twice as many trips with this sled keep the logs secure until you can raise them. When the boaters arrive to ferry more wood across the river, you send 3 men to prepare another sled. That sled, fashioned from green ash and reinforced with leather straps, will serve in place of horses that would break trail in mud. You walk alongside as they fasten the first of 10 oak posts to the runners. Each post weighs nearly the same as the beam you just placed. The men tie each end with fresh leather thongs, tested beforehand in boiling water to shrink them and tighten their grip as they dry. One neighbor cautions that wet leather shrinks unpredictably, so they often use thicker straps to begin. Each strap forms loops securing timber to sled, yet easily cut when you reach the building site. With 3 sleds in rotation, you establish a steady flow. While one group hauls logs, another collects saplings for temporary braces and walkways. A third group brings water and food to workers in the clearing. Everyone moves with purpose. The sound of splintering wood, metal, scraping on chuck holes, and leather thongs rubbing against logs creates a symphony of labor that echoes across the woods. By late afternoon, the third oak beam reaches its final resting place. You measure its alignment and call for the men to adjust as needed, prying with poles until each side sits level. Crowds gather to watch this progress. Children dart between logs, carrying water or slabs of salted pork that will fortify workers before evening. Women set baking stones near the clearing's edge to warm flatbreads later. Smoke from small fires drifts through the trees, scented with pine and a hint of cooking stew. As dusk approaches, the last sled returns empty, its runners scarred but solid. You gather everyone in a circle around a central fire. Neighbors share ale and roast simple meat from a spit. The conversation drifts from tomorrow's work to tales of old cottages and storms that forced rebuilding in spring. You listen as an elder recounts how uneven logs once caused a cottage wall to sag under snow. You nod, resolved that current logs lie true and straight to avoid similar fate. Night falls, and lanterns hang from provisional poles to light the clearing. You sit on a split oak stump and arrange logs in approximate positions for the morning framing. Each log casts long shadows under the lantern's glow. You imagine how great beams will lock into mortise and tenon joints once lifted into place. You run a hand along a split oak beam, feeling the smooth grain. A chill breeze rustles leaves and carries distant howls of wolves. You shiver but remember that by tomorrow these logs will become the skeleton of a dwelling. Before calling an end to the day's labors, you walk to the edge of the clearing. You toss last scraps of bark and wood chips into a small bonfire that you feed with kindling. As flames lick the night air, you think of the work ahead. You must rise at first light and return to the forest for more logs. Then you will haul beams, raise the skeleton of the cottage, and fit each timber into place. It will be weeks before walls stand tall and roof trusses link over the hearth. But tonight, with 3 beams in place and more logs ready to come, you feel the satisfaction of progress. Each, the swing of the axe and every haul of the sled brings you closer to shelter that will house your family for generations. You extinguish the fire and return to camp under stars shining bright overhead. The pounding in your legs and arms reminds you that this work will test your strength daily. But as you lie on your bed of furs, you recall the sight of fallen logs placed straight and true. You think of children playing among the beams tomorrow morning, and you drift to sleep, thinking that each burden carried today has forged the bones of a home yet to rise. Before dawn, you make your way to the pen where your oxen stand tethered to thick wooden yokes. The air is cool and crisp, and the low light of early morning reveals mist rising from the grass. 2 large oxen, each as broad as a cartwheel, lower their heads and chew slowly on bales of hay. You place a leather strap around the neck of the lead ox and stroke its coarse hair, murmuring words of reassurance. You recall how last winter their strength helped haul firewood through icy snow. Today they will haul heavy oak beams from the forest edge to the clearing where your cottage will rise. You step to the forest's edge and examine the first beam to transport. It is a stout oak post split and shaped the day before. The post measures 10 feet long and 4 inches thick at its narrowest end. A neighbor stands ready with a simple lever made from a bent sapling. You command the lever to pry one end of the post into a crude wooden travois. The travois consists of two long poles tied together with crossbeams, forming a U shape that cradles the log. You slide the harness under the other end of the post and secure it with leather thongs. Your neighbors gather around to watch. One holds a sack of grain to reward the oxen later. Another brushes stray branches from the path between the forest and the clearing. A young man grips the lever's end, ready to shift weight at your signal. With careful balance, you shift the beam so the weight rests evenly on the travois. You adjust the leather strap to ensure the wood sits firmly. The oxen snort as harness straps tighten across their broad backs. At your call, the team of oxen begins to move. Their legs churn the soft earth as they pull the beam toward the clearing. You walk beside them, keeping one hand on the lead ox's yoke and the other holding a long staff to guide their steps. Every so often, the beam bounces against a root or rock. You and neighbors use poles to push the beam aside from obstacles. Your breath comes in steady gasps as you pace alongside the slow march of the oxen. The path is rough and muddy in places. Rain from 2 days earlier left shallow puddles that soak your boots. Moss and small plants grow between stones, making footing treacherous. Still, the oxen press onward, unperturbed by the uneven ground. Their hooves dig into the soil, and you feel each tremor through your leather-soled boots. You stop once to rest the oxen and remove stones lodged against the travois runner. In that moment of pause, you turn and look back at the forest. Tall pines stand silent, as though watching your progress. You take a sip from a water skin, feeling cool water calm your throat. When the beam reaches the clearing, your neighbors form a circle around the end of the travois. You slip a pair of wooden pegs under the beam's end and lever it off the sled. With a collective grunt, they lift the beam onto a rack of logs that holds it close to the foundation markers. You adjust its position so it lies exactly where you intend to raise it later as a post. The sun rises higher, and golden light warms the clearing. You wipe sweat from your brow and move to fetch the next beam from the forest edge. You repeat the process for 3 more oak beams and 2 ash beams. Each load requires patience and careful guiding of the oxen. Each time you and your neighbors lift the beam from the travois onto the racks near the foundation. You mark each log with chalk to keep track of which one will serve as a post, which one will be a crossbeam, and which will brace the gable ends. As the morning progresses, a dozen beams line the clearing, ready to form the structure's skeleton. By midday, the work shifts to raising the first post. This oak beam, split precisely the day before, stands 10 feet tall. Its base is cut at a slight angle to sit flush in a footing hole. You carve a simple mortise near the top end, so that a crossbeam will later slot into it. Neighbors gather around the post, each standing on one side. You hold a wooden mallet and guide the beam vertical. Others grip the base and push, while 2 neighbors dig away loose earth to ensure the post sits firmly in its hole. Once the base nestles into place, a neighbor uses a wooden wedge to pack earth around the post so that it stands upright on its own. Now the real test begins. You place a crossbeam on small trestles nearby. This crossbeam will lock the post in place once lifted into position. 4 neighbors position themselves to lift the beam. You climb onto a sturdy log to act as a guide. At your word, they hoist the beam, straining against its weight. Their muscles ripple with effort as they align the crossbeam with the mortise in the upright post. The fit is tight, each edge matching like puzzle pieces. You guide the crossbeam into the mortise with gentle taps of the mallet until it seats fully. Neighbors let out a triumphant cheer as the post stands square with the crossbeam locked firmly at its head. Suddenly, a shout arises from the forest edge. A neighbor signals that the final load of rafters arrives. These rafters consist of lighter cedar and pine logs shaped to slope toward the center. You leave the half-raised post for now and go to meet the team leading the oxen. They pull the cedar rafters into the clearing, using the travois that already sits empty. You watch the logs slide along the runners and come to rest near the first post. You measure the rafters' length, ensuring they reach from ridge to eave once the frame is complete. By mid-afternoon, the first of 6 posts stands at each corner of the planned cottage. Between each pair of posts, you place a temporary wooden brace to maintain spacing and angle. These braces will hold the posts upright until all posts stand and the frame is secure. You walk around each post, tapping with a cloth-wrapped mallet to judge firmness. You note spots where the post shifts slightly and order neighbors to pack additional earth against its base. Each adjustment brings the post into plumb so that walls will rise straight. Throughout the day, you assign younger neighbors to gather more stakes from the forest for the next stage. Others prepare mortise and tenon joints for crossbeams that will tie posts together. You take a moment to fashion a simple tool from a curved branch that will help bend a rafter into place later. Its shape matches the wood grain of the cedar poles, making positioning easier under strain. As evening light fades, you step back to admire the half-raised frame. 6 posts stand sentinel around the rectangle, looming like silent guards. Crossbeams match their slots, and each corner sits close to true right angles. Wooden braces lean against pairs of posts, supporting them like crutches. You feel the bones of your cottage coming to life. The air hums with mosquitoes drawn to sweat and the damp earth. You tap a horn sounded by neighbors to summon dinner from nearby hearth fires. Under lamplight, you carve wooden pegs and shape small oak wedges to secure joints later. You know that tomorrow you will remove temporary braces and rely on permanent joints to hold the frame steady. You prepare tar mixed with animal fat to seal beams where they intersect, fending off water damage when rain comes. You stop to listen as night creaks through the forest. Leaves rustle overhead and a distant owl calls. You recall that once this frame stands solid, you will weave wattle walls and apply daub to seal the structure. Then thatch will form a roof to shed rain and keep out winter's chill. You return to the small campfire, where neighbors warm stew and bread on flat stones. You taste the sharp sweetness of wild onions thrown into the brew. You pass a flask of cider between fellow builders. Around the fire, they share stories of earlier cottages lost to storms or rot. You nod, knowing that strong beams and proper joints can prevent such fates. You recall how years ago a neighbor's family lost their roof when rafters sagged under snow. Now you vow that your own work will withstand years of wind and weather. When the moon rises, you extinguish the fire and retreat to your sleeping pallet of furs. Tomorrow demands you return at first light to complete the frame and begin weaving walls. As you drift to sleep, you picture the posts standing stiff against the moonlight, promising shelter and warmth for your family. Each beam hauled, each post raised, brings you closer to a home, born of sweat and community effort. In that quiet moment, you feel the bond between neighbors and the hope that this sturdy frame will become a refuge against storms and hardship. Each log you brought here holds the memory of the forest and the promise of a future filled with laughter and safety. You breathe deeply and rest, ready for the work dawn will bring. With the posts now standing in their prepared holes and secured by temporary braces, your attention turns to raising the heavy oak crossbeams that will tie the posts into a rigid frame. By morning light, you and your neighbors gather around the first upright post. The beam you intend to set rests on a rack of logs nearby. You eye the beam's mortise cut and the corresponding tenon carved into the post. To lift the beam into position, you will need more hands, as well as ropes and pulleys fashioned from local materials. You retrieve a length of hemp rope spun by local weavers. Its fibers feel rough beneath your calloused hands. You tie one end of the rope around the beam's midpoint, looping it twice to ensure it will not slip. With the other end, you fashion a simple block and tackle system using a wooden pulley carved from a solid branch. The pulley's axle is a stout oak peg driven through a hole in a forked tree branch felled near the clearing. You suspend this forked branch from a higher beam that will later become part of the roof ridge. For now, it rests supported across two shorter posts set near the center of the frame. This central ridge support stands 15 feet tall, its base wedged into the earth so it remains stable. Once the pulley hangs securely, you and two neighbors pull on the rope to tighten the loops. Around the beam, strong oak posts form 3 points of support: the two corner posts and the central ridge post. You position the beam so that its tenon end sits loosely in the mortise of the first post. Neighbors gather to steady the beam. You loop the rope over the pulley and grip the pulley and grip. Free end. At your signal, you begin to pull downward, raising the beam's far end toward the top of the first post. Sweat beads on your brow as you heave, muscles straining against the weight. The beam moves inch by inch, creaking as it shifts into place. When the end reaches the mortise, two neighbors guide it horizontally until it seats fully. You press the beam downward to ensure a snug fit. Once the tenon locks into the mortise, you drive a wooden peg through the joint to prevent any movement. The next task is to set the opposite end of the crossbeam into the mortise of the second upright post. This second post stands parallel to the first, and you use a second pulley system to hoist the beam's other end. You reposition the rope over the new pulley, which hangs from a forked scaffold beam laid across two adjacent posts. At your command, neighbors pull in unison, lifting the beam until it clears the bracket notch of the second post. With careful guidance, the beam slides into the mortise. You inspect the joint for any gap and push a wedge of elm under the beam for a tighter fit. You drive in another wooden peg to secure the connection. By midday, two posts now share a crossbeam between them. This beam will serve as the sill for the future floor and now provides lateral stability to those posts. You step back and measure the spacing, confirming that each post now lies exactly where it should. The structure begins to take on a defined shape, each beam forming a rigid triangle with its adjacent posts. You know that tomorrow you will repeat this process for the remaining pairs of posts and tie them together with upper beams. As afternoon warms, you address the need to lift rafters into place. The rafters will span from the outside posts to the central ridge post, forming the skeleton of the roof. Neighbors gather bundles of straight ash poles previously split and carved. Each pole measures roughly 12 feet long and tapers to a point at one end where it will fit into a notch in the ridge beam. Working in teams of 3, you form a human chain from the rack of rafters to the base of the posts. One neighbor steadies the rafter's peak end, while another lifts along its midpoint. You guide the base to rest on a small wooden cradle at the corner post base. Then you run a rope through a hole near the rafter's peak and loop the rope over a temporary pulley hung from the ridge support. At your signal, everyone pulls together, and the rafter ascends in a slow arc. Two neighbors at the ridge cradle its peak as it emerges from the pulley above. Sparks of sawdust drift from where the rafter scarfed ridge notch scrapes against rough edges. Once the peak nestles into the notch atop the ridge post, you and a helper climb a short ladder to adjust the rafter by tapping with a mallet until it sits flush. Down below, two neighbors push the base of the rafter until it slips into the bracket cut into the top of the corner post. You drive a small wedge into that junction to lock it. When at last the rafter stands at its predefined angle, the angled silhouette casts long shadows across the clearing. This process repeats until each corner post and interior support receives a rafter. You pause after 4 rafters are set, each forming a triangular frame that guides rainwater off the future roof. The symmetry pleases you, and neighbors murmur approval. With rafters in place, you climb down and cap each rafter peak with a thin belt of birch bark. This serves as a protective shim between the rafter and ridge beam, preventing moisture from collecting at the joint. You smear animal fat on the bark to further repel water, Two neighbors climb carefully to tap the bark in place while you feed them strips cut from birch. Next, you turn to raising the ridge beam that will tie all rafters together at the apex. This ridge beam is a long oak pole split and straightened until it reaches a diameter nearly equal to the rafters. You position it on smaller logs at the base of the ridge support. Neighbors lift one end onto a wooden sled fashioned for this beam and haul it close to the support posts with ropes and pulleys. You haul the ridge beam into position atop the apex. The moment the beam balances between rafters, you feel the structure become whole. Neighbors step forward to fit. Tenons carved on the ridge beam ends into corresponding mortises on the central post and the faders. Secondary support post at the opposite side of the cottage. You drive pegs into those joints. Smile as the frame settles, rigid and square. After setting the ridge, you place temporary scaffolding boards on rafters to form a working platform. This gives you and others a stable footing as you add reinforcements and begin weaving laths between rafters to support thatch later. You position the scaffolding accessed by a ladder propped against a sturdy post. Carefully, you step up to the platform and look down at the clearing below. Here stand the 6 posts connected by crossbeams and rafters, forming a skeletal outline of the cottage. The structure catches the last rays of sun, and you know that soon only wattle and daub will separate you from the elements. Before dusk, you instruct 4 neighbors to gather bundles of green hazel rods for weaving. These rods will thread between upright posts and crossbeams to form the walls. You instruct another pair to carve smaller blocks of oak to serve as spacers between each layer of rods, ensuring an even weave. As the light fades, you climb down from the scaffolding and inspect each joint. Mortise edges align smoothly, posts stand true, and beams are level. You nod, satisfied that the frame will withstand wind and rain and support thatch. As night falls, you and your neighbors prepare a meal around a small fire. You roast strips of salt, pork over the embers, and warm flatbreads pressed beside the coals. The day's work has tested your strength and will. Each log hauled by oxen and each post raised by hand brought you closer to a home that will stand for decades. You speak with your fellow builders about tomorrow's tasks, beginning to weave wattle walls, building the hearth, and thatching the roof. By the time you retire to a camp of firs under the stars, you feel exhaustion settling into your bones. As you lie flat on your back, you look up at the sky. The silhouette of the timber frame stands tall against moonlight. In this moment, you know that your labors have transformed the forest's gifts into something enduring. You drift to sleep with thoughts of the cottage's future, warmth and laughter. The frame you helped raise will soon hold stones and straw, clay and memory. In darkness, you feel the weight of responsibility lighten, carried by the promise that tomorrow's labor will bring shelter and stability for family and tribe alike. You rise before dawn and step into the clearing with a leather satchel slung over one shoulder. In it, you carry simple tools for preparing the foundation: a spade with a sturdy ash handle, a wooden mallet made from dense oak, and several lengths of rope braided from hemp. The sun's first rays ignite dew on grass blades as you walk to the edge of the space where the cottage will stand. Yesterday you traced a chalk line around the perimeter to mark where the trench should run. Now you stand at that line and mark stakes at each corner, driving small oak pegs into the soil. From each peg you stretch a length of linen cord to mark straight edges, sketching a perfect rectangle in the soft earth. With lines drawn true and square, you are ready to begin digging. You remove your leather satchel and set it on the ground. You undo its flap and withdraw the spade. You grasp the handle with both hands and press the blade into the turf. The soil parts beneath the spade, revealing damp earth beneath. You sink the blade a hand deep and lever the first block of sod free, tossing it aside where it will not impede later work. You continue along the chalk line, slicing a narrow trench about 12 inches wide and 8 inches deep. Each swing of the spade sends clods of earth flying. You pause, only to wipe sweat from your brow, or to rinse the blade in a fresh pail of water carried from the nearby stream. As you work, you recall that a proper foundation must rest on firm stone, so that the cabin's posts will not settle unevenly over time. You dig slowly and carefully to maintain a consistent depth. When your trench nears a corner, you drop to one knee to measure the depth with a wooden rod. 8 inches below the surface, you feel gravel mingled with clay. Satisfied, you return to your rhythm of digging. Your neighbor arrives with baskets woven from willow, filled with stones collected yesterday. Each stone is roughly the size of a fist, and smooth from stream tumbling. You nod in greeting and push a basket toward the trench. Together, you and your neighbor lift each stone from the basket and place it in the trench. The heaviest stones occupy the bottom, forming a stable bed. You fill gaps between larger stones with smaller pebbles, pressing them into crevices so that no empty space remains. With each stone, you pack the trench more solidly. When you finish 1 foot of trench, you stand and stamp down the stones with the wooden mallet, sending vibrations through the ground. This compaction ensures that the stones will not shift when weight presses down on them. When you complete the layer of stones several inches high, you brush additional loose earth into the trench, covering the stones by an inch. You then tamp the earth down, blending it with the packed stones beneath. You repeat this pattern stone, pebble fill, tamped earth until the top of the trench matches the ground surface. The finished footing is firm and level, ready to carry the load of the wooden posts. As morning light strengthens, other neighbors arrive carrying additional baskets of stone. You assign one pair to continue digging the trench, and another pair to haul stones to the newly dug sections. A third neighbor carries buckets of water from the stream to rinse dirt and dust from stones as needed. The work flows in a steady routine. The workers dig, remove sod, collect stones, pack them, and tamp down the earth. No words are wasted. Each man and woman focuses on their role. Children watch from the camp shaded by an overhanging oak, learning the rhythms of labor that will serve them when they build their own farmsteads. Midday arrives with the sun high in the sky. The trench now runs continuously around the rectangle, marking your cottage's shape. Each side measures 10 paces, or about 60 feet in length. At the corners, the footing stones cross, so that walls will have equal support on each side. You face south and rest for a moment, drinking cold water from a wooden cup. You survey the lines of packed stones that gleam where a stray ray of sun touches damp earth. The foundation appears sturdy and even. Next, you must prepare the holes for the vertical posts. Each corner will receive a post that rises to support the roof. You step to a corner where the trench bedding extends and scrape away soil to reveal packed stones only a hand below. You mark a square hole 2 hands wide and 1 span deep, cutting into the foundation bed. With the spade, you cut a small block of earth and stones, then pry it free. You pile the removed mixture aside to refill later. The hole is deep enough to hold the post's base securely. You insert a post scribe you carved from a pointed branch to measure depth and adjust the hole until the post's base will rest on a stone beneath. You repeat this for the opposite corner and both remaining corners. Each hole must sit exactly where the chalk marks intersect the stone footing. As you work, you place a flat stone at the bottom of each hole so that the post will bear on rock rather than loose earth. When each corner hole has its bedrock stone in place, you cover them temporarily with smaller stones to prevent accidental stepping in the holes. With hole beds prepared, you walk back to the camp where upright posts lie seasoned from weeks of drying. You select the first post, a sturdy oak beam about 10 feet long with a flat end for the base and a tenon carved into the top. You and 2 neighbors carry it to the first corner. You stand at the hole and help guide the post upright. The other 2 lift from either side, bracing it vertically. As they set the base onto the prepared stone, you slide slender wooden wedges around the post to hold it upright. You fit wedges on opposite sides between the post and the earth so that it stands plumb. You then step away to inspect the post. Using a simple plumb line made from twine and a small stone, you dangle the line beside the post to ensure it stands straight. The stone swings to the center of the post's face. You mark the direction and adjust wedges until the line remains true. A neighbor uses the wooden mallet to tighten the wedges, driving them deeper so that the post does not shift. Once the post stands true, you measure from the post's top to a height where the roof's lower. Rafters will sit. You mark that point with chalk. Then you align a long pole horizontally against the post at the marked height. This pole serves as a gauge to ensure that the next post sits at the same height and alignment. With chalk, you mark the spot on each remaining post so that all 4 will be level with each other once trimmed. Next, you move to the second corner. The neighbors carry the second post to its hole. You lift the post's base onto the flat stone and place wedges beneath its sides. You again use the plumb line to check verticality and adjust wedges until the post stands straight. With the horizontal gauge poles strapped in place from the first post to this one, you confirm that the sides of your cottage will be level and square. You tap the post gently with the mallet and listen for a solid sound indicating it sits firmly. You repeat this process for the third and fourth posts. Each time you measure carefully and ensure that each new post aligns with the gauge pole and the plumb line. When the final post stands, you step back and admire the quartet of uprights, each rising like sentinels from the packed stone footings. Between each post, you shore up the holes by packing in earth and small stones around the base. You stamp down the mixture firmly with your boot, ensuring no space remains beneath the post bottom. This packing prevents posts from rattling or settling lower under weight. Each wedge remains in place to hold the post upright and to resist lateral movement. As afternoon wanes, you cut and brace temporary supports between posts. You attach horizontal braces at mid-height to tie the posts together. These braces consist of smaller ash poles, notched into each post and driven into place with the mallet. The structure now feels rigid. You push gently on one post, and the entire frame shifts as one piece rather than each post swaying independently. With the posts secure, you return to the empty holes you used to hold wedges. You fill them with leftover packed earth and small stones, leveling the ground around each corner. You smooth the soil where the packed footing meets the surface, so that future walls will have even contact with the earth. As dusk approaches, you glance back at the posts rising from the earth. Each stands firmly on its stone base and secures the rectangle of the cottage's frame. In those posts, you see the promise of shelter and warmth for your family. You recall how yesterday you prepared the stone footings and filled trenches. Now, in these hours, you have raised the ribs of your home, ready to support beams and walls. A light breeze rustles the leaves overhead. You feel a deep satisfaction. The foundation is laid, and the posts stand proud against the sky. With night falling, you gather neighbors in a circle around a shared fire. They bring fresh bread and salted meat, passing portions as the embers glow red. You tell of tomorrow's plan, shaping the crossbeams and lifting them into place to bind the posts together. You mention how you will carve notches and mortise joints so that each beam fits snugly. In their eyes, you see pride at what you have achieved together and determination for the work ahead. As you return to your simple tent at the edge of the clearing, you pause to look at the posts. Under moonlight, each post casts a long, slender shadow across the leveled earth. You sense the presence of ancestors who once built homes in this land using similar methods. Their knowledge flows through you as you step into the shelter of the forest's edge. Lying down on furs and blankets, you let exhaustion wash over you, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow brings new tasks, but also the promise that this foundation will endure through storms and seasons for years to come. With the 4 corner posts now standing firmly on packed stone footings, the moment has come to bind them together into a single rigid frame. You instruct 2 neighbors to fetch crossbeams of oak that were split and carved earlier. Each crossbeam measures about 8 hands wide and spans the distance between posts with only a small overhang. You set one beam at the base to serve as the floor sill, another near mid-height to stiffen the frame, and a third near the top to support the wall plates and future roof rafters. First, you turn to the lower sill beam. You and 3 neighbors lift it from the ground where it lay. Waiting, the beam's tenons at each end fit into mortises cut into the face of each post. You approach the first corner post, sliding the beam's end into the mortise. A neighbor steadies the post while you position the beam horizontally. When the beam end seats firmly, you tap it with a wooden mallet until it fits snugly. You then move to the opposite post and guide the sill beam into its matching mortise. A satisfying thunk echoes as the tenon locks into its slot. You step back and measure the spacing between posts to confirm the beam lies perfectly level. You use a simple water level made from a length of hollowed bark tube and a small amount of water. The water settles evenly, indicating the beam is level. You wipe away excess water and turn your attention to driving wooden pegs through holes in the tenon to prevent any play. 2 pegs, hammered into place, hold the sill beam firmly against the posts. With the lower sill in place, you gather rubble, stone and soil from the trenches and pack it tightly around the sill beam's base. This backfilling seals the beam and prevents moisture from pooling beneath the cottage floor. You ensure the earth slopes slightly away from the sill to direct rainwater toward the perimeter drainage ditch. Once complete, you wipe your brow and move to the next level. The mid-height beam performs a crucial role. It braces the posts against lateral forces. You retrieve the mid-beam stored near the clearing's edge. It spans from one post to its neighbor, running along each side of the rectangle. You and 2 neighbors lift the mid-beam and align its tenon end with the mortise on one post. You gently tap it into place with the mallet, listening for the beam to settle fully. Then you kneel beside the opposite post and slide the mid-beam into its mortise. You place a level across the beam to confirm it sits plumb between posts. When you find a slight tilt, you tap under one end of the beam with a wooden wedge until the level sits true. At that point, you drive pegs into the tenons to lock the beam firmly. You repeat this process for each of the 4 sides. Walking around the cottage footings in a circle, the frame begins to look like a crude box, each side supported by a substantial beam that ties posts together. It is now time to install the upper beam, sometimes called the lintel or wall plate. This beam will carry the weight of the roof rafters. You retrieve it from the storage rack where it dried. It carries notches at each end cut to match the post tops. You climb a small step ladder to reach one post, top, and guide the beam's tenon into the mortise. A neighbor braces the post while you ensure the beam sits flush. With careful taps of the mallet, you seat the tenon fully. Next, you move to the adjacent post and slide the beam end into its mortise. The beam spans from post to post, forming a continuous band around the cottage. You look overhead and notice that when the beam sits properly, it just clears the ropes that held rafters earlier. You remove the ropes so the rafters can rest directly on this beam later. After the lintel beam seats into its mortises on both facing posts, you place a second ladder against the adjacent side. You climb carefully to the top of that post and tap the beam until it slides squarely into place. Neighbors on the ground feed you wet clay to seal gaps between tenon and mortise. You rub clay around each joint to prevent rainwater from seeping into the wood. Then you drive oak pegs through each tenon 10 fingers from the ends to fully secure it. The peg's head protrudes slightly, serving as a reminder of craftsmanship, and also a point where wall laths later need to be trimmed around the peg head. Now all 4 lintel beams form the top of the frame, connecting corner posts and reinforcing each face. You step back to inspect the structure. The posts rise from immersed stone footings. Cross beams at the base, mid-height, and top tie the posts together. The frame stands rigid and square despite minimal bracing. You run a plumb line down each post face to ensure they remain perfectly vertical. Satisfied, you turn to reinforce corners from the outside by driving smaller diagonal braces. You cut 4 ash poles for corner bracing. Each pole is about 5 hands long and tapered at both ends. Near the base of one corner, you notch the wood pole so that it fits snugly against both adjacent faces. With a neighbor holding one end, you insert the other into a shallow notch carved into the ground just outside the footing. The pole now braces diagonally from ground to post mid-height. You use a mallet to drive small wedges between brace and post so the pole cannot shift. This diagonal brace prevents racking when strong winds blow. You repeat at each corner, tying braces to the mid-height beam with leather thongs. The braces hold the frame steady during the next stages of construction. As the afternoon sun warms the clearing, you turn to pack earth back into the remaining open areas near the posts. You shovel loose earth around the perimeter, filling minor gaps between trench and beam ends. You ensure the ground slopes away from the cottage so that rainwater cannot pool near footings. Once the earth lies smooth, you press it down with your boot to firm it. You then sprinkle coarse sand around the base of each post to create a dry zone that discourages rot. Your neighbors rest under the shade of a large beech to catch their breath and eat midday bread. You inspect each joint once more, listening for any creak or shift in the oak. The beams hold firm. The cottage frame stands tall and true, the heft of each beam anchored by stone and sealed by clay. By late afternoon, you gather the plan for installing floor joists between the base sill beams. Tomorrow you intend to lay boards that will form the cottage floor, but before that you must trim each post top where rafters will rest. You retrieve a handsaw and climb a ladder to a post top. You saw through excess length of the post so that its top sits flush with lintel beam. You smooth the cut surface with a draw knife, shaving away splinters until the wood feels smooth beneath your palm. At this height, you carve a small notch in the post to receive the rafter tenon. The notch sits just above the lintel beam, oriented toward the cottage centerline. You examine the notch and make slight adjustments so that a rafter can be held securely. After this post is trimmed, you descend and repeat for the next post until all 4 post tops stand level with their notches carved. Each notch deepness is consistent so that rafters will rest uniformly. You place a temporary piece of lintel wood on top of the posts to check uniform height. The piece sits level, confirming that no post stands higher or lower than its neighbor. You remove the temporary lintel and set it aside. As dusk approaches, you fashion small oak wedges to later wedge rafters into place. These wedges taper thinly and will slip between rafter and post to lock them tightly. You bundle them and hang them from a peg on one post, so they will be easy to retrieve when you raise rafters. The final task of the day is to clear the ground surrounding the posts. You and neighbors drag stones and debris from the edges of the trench area. Weeds and small plants that once cluttered the edges now lie raked into piles to be burned in a small fire off to the side. The ground now presents a neat tapestry of earth and footings, ready for floor beams. You build a small cooking fire beneath the shade of a nearby tree. Neighbors gather around as you roast strips of dried venison over coals. Each man and woman takes turns dipping pieces into melted animal fat for flavor. You pass bread soaked in hot broth. Between mouthfuls you discuss the work of tomorrow, laying floor planks, erecting inner walls of wattle and daub, and bracing the frame for thatch once rafters ascend. Night falls, and you retrieve a length of linen cloth to wrap around your shoulders as you lie upon a bed of furs. You gaze at the frame silhouetted against the starry sky. Each post stands strong. Each beam ties the structure into a coherent whole. You think of families that will gather under this roof, children running across the floor you will build tomorrow. You remember the labor of every neighbor's hand and the sweat spilled to drive each peg and secure each beam. Exhaustion settles in your bones, yet satisfaction warms your heart. The foundation and posts stand as evidence of your combined efforts and skills, passed down through generations. You close your eyes under that open sky, confident that tomorrow's sunrise will find a sturdy frame, ready to hold the cottage's walls and roof. In the hush of the night, you drift to sleep, knowing that each corner of solid earth and stone anchors a home built by hope and labor. Dawn's light filters through the trees as you emerge into the clearing for the next stage of your cottage construction. With the upright posts firmly in place yesterday, today's task is to build the frame that will tie those posts together and support the roof. Each crossbeam must fit precisely into mortise and tenon joints carved by hand. You begin by gathering tools: a sturdy chisel with wear, a handle of seasoned ash, a mallet carved from dense oak, a straight edge made from a finely planed board, and a length of chalk mixed from limestone powder. These simple tools guide your hand and eye toward precise work. First, you choose an oak crossbeam, destined to span between two adjacent posts near the base, forming what will become the sill for the future floor. You position the beam on trestles at waist height, allowing easy access to both faces. With the straight edge, you draw a horizontal line across the beam at the exact depth of the mortise you will cut. You hold the chalk against the straight edge and run it along the wood, leaving a crisp line that marks where the tenon's shoulders will rest once inserted into the post's mortise. Below this line, you draw two vertical lines that mark the tenon's edges. The result looks like a rectangular band drawn on the beam's end. Next, you measure the thickness of the post's wall at the mortise location, ensuring that the tenon's width matches precisely. You mark the beam's end accordingly, using a measuring stick carved with local units of length. You check the measurement twice before making any cuts. A slight error will produce a joint that sits either too loosely or too tight. You must get it right the first time, because misaligned beams can weaken the entire structure. With chalk lines clear, you set the beam's end flush against a chopping block of hardwood. The mallet and chisel sit ready. You take the chisel in one hand, mallet in the other. Positioning the chisel's beveled edge on the chalk line, you tap the mallet gently until the chisel bit sinks slightly into the oak. Each tap removes a small chip of wood. You work methodically, slicing off thin slivers as you follow the outline of the tenon, removing wood down to the line. Droplets of sweat bead on your brow as the morning sun warms the clearing. You focus on each chisel blow, mindful that too deep a cut could weaken the tenon or cause a crack in the beam. Once you cut the outline, you transform the chisel's angle slightly to pare away excess wood between the tenon cheeks and the beam's face. You run the chisel flat against the wood and tap firmly to remove material, creating a flat shoulder. As you progress, you turn the beam in your hands to check for smoothness and squareness. You press a small block of scrap wood against the tenon shoulder to test whether it sits flush with the beam's face. When snug, you use the mallet to adjust minor high spots, tapping the chisel gently to even the surface. Next comes the mortise in the post that will receive this tenon. You select the corresponding post and examine its face. The outline of the tenon aligns with chalk lines drawn yesterday. You place the chisel at the top of the mortise outline and knock the mallet so the chisel sinks into the post. Each blow cuts a notch deeper. Once the chisel penetrates a half-hand's depth, you remove the wood chips by angling the chisel slightly and flicking them out. You continue cutting along the chalked border until you have chiseled down to the required depth. At this point, you pare away the wood between the two sides of the mortise until the cavity is square and clean. You then place the tenon into the mortise to test the fit. It slides in with a quiet thud, though you bided. Notice a small gap near the shoulder. You remove the tenon and use the chisel to pare the tenon, mortise's shoulder, until the tenon sits flush. You tap the beam with the mallet and watch that the tenon does not rock or shift. Satisfied, you drive a wooden peg through a pre-drilled hole in both tenon and post, locking the joint. This labor repeats for each crossbeam. A beam to tie the posts at mid-height must fit mortises cut into opposite posts. You mark its tenon ends carefully, ensuring each tenon length and width matches the mortise precisely. You pare by chisel and tap with the mallet until all tenon cheeks are even. When you test the tenon in the mortise, you hear a satisfying crack of wood meeting wood. You drive the peg and then step back to examine the joint. No daylight appears between beam and post. The joint now resists twisting, able to bear heavy weight. Between these two crossbeams and the sill, the posts stand firmly bound. You fetch another oak beam destined as a wall plate at the top of the posts. Again, you mark shoulders and mortise locations with chalk and measuring stick. The top beam must fit into notches carved at the post tops. These notches must match the beam's thickness exactly. Using the chisel, you cut away the post's face to create a flat shoulder. The depth matches the beam's thickness, so that when inserted, the beam will rest level with the post head. Once the notch is cut for each post, you insert the beam across the posts. You stand on a small platform and guide its end into the first post's notch. You tap it down gently until it sits flush. At the other post's notch, you repeat the process. As the beam seats into both posts, the frame stiffens further. You drive wooden pegs through the notches where the beam meets the post on either side, ensuring no movement. By midday, the sun stands high, and you break for water and bread. Neighbors gather around the shaded area, offering freshly drawn water from the spring. You sip and wipe sweat from your brow. The frame now consists of 4 posts, 3 crossbeams at different heights, and notches prepared to hold rafters later. You turn your attention to reinforcing the corners with angled braces. These braces require tenons and mortises as well. You select ash poles for braces because ash is flexible yet strong. You mark the tens on the end of the brace, where it will fit into a shallow notch carved into the mid-beam. You use the chisel and mallet once more, shaving away wood until the tenon slides into the mortise without resistance. At the post base, you carve another notch to fit the brace's other tenon. Once both ends fit, you drive a small wooden peg to lock the brace. You step back to behold the frame. Its edges define the cottage's shape, shadows from high. Posts trace patterns on the ground as clouds drift across the sky. You note how each beam and post meets precisely, bearing testament to careful measurement and skilled chiseling. Now you prepare joists for the floor. These joists will fit into mortises on the inside face of the lower sill beam. You mark each joist's tenons, ensuring uniform length and width. As before, you chisel the wood to create clean tenons that will slide into mortises on the beam. You test each tenon in its mortise. When it fits flush, you secure it with pegs. You repeat until the floor joists span the distance between beams, spaced evenly for strength. With floor joists in place, the skeleton of your cottage stands fully braced. You collect sawdust and small wood chips to scatter around the base of posts and beams to catch any errant moisture. You sweep the floor area free of debris, leaving a neat rectangle enclosed by beams. Afternoon wanes as you work on rafters next, marking tenons and mortises for the roof structure atop the wall plates. But in this first section of building the frame and crossbeams, the essential joints now bind posts into a single, solid unit. Each beam locked by mortise and tenon carries weight evenly across all posts. No nail or metal support stands between you and the structure, only your hands. A sharp chisel and measured care ensure the cottage will endure. By dusk, you climb onto a temporary platform to survey your work. The frame's joints gleam where mortise and tenon meet. You reflect on how this wooden skeleton will one day hold thatch and walls, keeping families safe through winter storms. Neighbors offer hearty remarks of approval, praising the tight joints and level beams. As twilight softens the clearing, you breathe deeply, content that each careful cut brings this dwelling closer to completion. At day's end, you store your chisel and mallet in a makeshift workshop near the clearing's edge. You fold the straight edge and measuring stick, placing them with other tools for tomorrow's tasks. The frame stands ready, awaiting the next stage, weaving walls of wattle and daub, and eventually, the placing of rafters to support the roof. You rest your hands on the lip of the sill beam, feeling its solid heft. As night rises, you know that the cottage's bones now stand strong, waiting to cradle hearth and home. After carving tenons on all cross beams and preparing the matching mortises on posts, you turn your attention to lifting and fitting each beam into place. Today, you must place the upper cross beam that joins front and back wall posts, and then fit intermediate beams that strengthen the frame. You gather neighbors at first light beside the clearing. Each carries a wooden lever or a length of hemp rope. You also bring a sturdy ladder fashioned from ash, its rungs cut smooth to prevent splinters. First, you move the long oak beam destined to span between the two front posts. This beam measures 16 feet long and weighs more than two neighbors can lift unsupported. You position two wooden sled runners beneath it, spacing them to cradle the beam. Your neighbors slide the beam onto the runners in unison. With leather straps, you secure the beam to prevent slipping. Neighbors then push the sled slowly toward the front posts. The path runs across packed earth with only minor roots to avoid. You walk alongside, guiding the path to ensure it remains straight. When the beam reaches the posts, neighbors lift one end onto sturdy wooden blocks placed at the base of each front post. You steady the beam as they adjust it so that the tenon end aligns with the mortise on the left post. A signal from you prompts them to slide the beam horizontally until the tenon tip seats fully into the post mortise. The beam now rests partly on its blocks and partially in the mortise. Next, you guide the opposite tenon into its mortise on the right post. Neighbors lift the beam's far end slightly and shift it into place. The tenon slides into the groove with a satisfying click. You confirm the beam sits level by placing a water level on its top surface and watching that the water remains still. Once level, you drive wooden pegs through drilled holes at each tenon to lock the beam firmly. Each peg sits flush with the wood, its head turned to blend with the surrounding grain. With the front crossbeam in place, you fetch another beam intended for the back posts. You repeat the process at the rear of the cottage. Neighbors haul the beam on sleds, lift each end onto blocks, and slide the tenons into their mortises. Once both ends seat, you drive pegs to secure the fit. Now front and back posts stand connected by sturdy horizontal oak. Next, you address the side crossbeams that join left and right posts at mid-height. You select a beam carved the day before and carry it to the left side. Each end will fit into a shallow notch cut in the face of the posts. You climb the ladder and guide one end into the left post notch. Neighbors lift the far end until its tenon lines up with the right post's notch. When the beam slots into place, you step down and tap it to check for gaps. You see a small drift of light between beam and post. Kneeling, you pair the notch edge with an adze until beam and post meet without space. Then a wooden peg locks the beam in place. You repeat on the opposite side, connecting the two back posts with another beam in the same manner. With all main crossbeams fitted, the frame now resembles a crude box with open floor and ceiling spaces. Each beam aligns flush with the post faces and sits level. The structure resists twisting when you lean against a post. Next, you add shorter beams between main crossbeams to support floor joists and future wall framing. These smaller members you cut from ash because ash is strong yet lighter than oak. You measure and cut each ash beam to fit snugly between sills and mid-beams. You mark tenon outlines on each beam end, then carve and pare until each tenon slides into its corresponding mortise with minimal force. Once all tenons fit, you haul these ash beams one by one and slot them into place, driving wooden dowels through to secure each joint. These internal beams provide anchoring points for floor joists and interior partitions. You pack clay around the base of each tenon within the mortise to seal out water and deter rot. As you work, you notice one ash beam sits slightly higher on one end. You raise a neighbor to lift that end and slip a thin wedge of oak beneath until level. After rebarring the fit, you drive a peg to lock it. Now each post and beam form a grid of rigid joints. You step back and measure diagonals across the floor area to ensure the shape is square. Both diagonal measurements match exactly. This confirms your careful carving and fitting produced a true rectangle. You clap your hands in satisfaction and share a nod with neighbors to celebrate this milestone. Before moving on, you install temporary braces to maintain rigidity as you add rafters. You cut a pair of diagonal braces from green hickory poles. On one corner, you fasten one brace between a front post and a mid-beam. You carve tenons on both ends to fit into shallow notches you cut. Once seated, you drive pegs to lock it. You repeat on each corner, forming an X shape on each frame face. These braces keep the posts from shifting as you work higher. Satisfied with the frame's stability, you shift focus to cutting room for floor joists. You stand on a small platform and mark positions on the sills for each joist. You plan them evenly spaced to support a thick bed of boards later. Using chalk and straight edge, you mark each tenon location on the sills. Then you use your chisel to carve matching mortises in each sill. Each mortise measures a hand deep and a finger wide. You test fit an end of an ash joist in each one and adjust the fit until snug. With mortises ready, you lift each ash joist into place and fit it into its slot. You drive pegs to secure each joint. Now the structure's floor will have solid beams beneath to support weight. You climb down and inspect the underside. Each joist lies flush with the sills and the mid-level beams. Underfoot, you test the frame's stiffness. It feels robust, no sign of sagging. Having placed all floor joists, you stack planks for the future floor nearby. You estimate tomorrow's work will involve laying those planks above the joists and nailing them in place with wooden nails made from hard spruce. You note damp patches of soil that lie near the sill beams and plan to cover those areas with a layer of dry sand to absorb moisture. You send a neighbor to fetch buckets of sand from a nearby dune, and others help spread the sand around the sills. As the afternoon sun lowers, you begin cutting small natural pegs from oak. You slice each peg from a branch, heating it over the cooking fire later so the wood shrinks slightly and tightens within its hole. You hollow out each dowel with an awl, ensuring it stands firm and resists shearing. These pegs will anchor additional beams once the roof framing begins. Before dusk, you prepare rafters for tomorrow's work. Each rafter end carries a tenon sized to fit the mortise notches you carved into the upper wall plate beam yesterday. You mark each rafter precisely and pare by chisel until each tenon seats flush. You then notch the peak end so it rests securely on the ridge beam. With rafters prepared, the frame now waits for the final stage of raising the roof. When night falls, you gather neighbors for a simple meal. In a common pot, you simmer vegetables in clear broth. A few villagers contribute dough for flat cakes cooked on heated stones. You sit around the fire as darkness settles and recount the day's work. Each neighbor shares stories of timber framing passed down from their fathers and grandfathers. Some speak of a roadside cottage lost to wind after poor joinery left gaps. You nod, knowing your careful work today ensures no such fate for this cottage. Later, as stars dot the sky, you lie upon furs and reflect on the day. The frame stands in the clearing, a testament to skill and cooperation. Each crossbeam and post join in harmony, bearing the promise of shelter. As moonlight glints off oak and ash, you drift towards sleep, ready for tomorrow's rise, when rafters will climb skyward and thatch will soon cover your home. You rise with the sun and carry your basket into the nearby coppice where hazel grows thick among alder and wych elm. Under your feet, early morning dew clings to fallen leaves. You gather slender rods of hazel about as thick as your thumb. The rods must remain green and flexible so they bend without breaking. You select only the straightest lengths, cutting them close to the ground with a small bill hook. Each cut sends a shower of tiny wood chips to the forest floor. You bind gathered rods into bundles tied with strips of leather so that neighbors can carry them easily to the building site later today. At the cottage clearing, broad stakes driven into the ground rise from the base beam. These stakes are made from oak split into lengths about 4 hands long and 6 fingers thick. They form the vertical supports for the wattle walls. You and 2 helpers begin to weave hazel rods horizontally between the stakes. You start at the bottom, pressing the first rod into a notch carved into a stake. Then you slip it behind the next stake and press it into place. Each rod weaves in and out like a ribbon through slots. The rods must lie snugly against both front and dode, back of the stakes for maximum strength. As you work upward, each new rod presses the previous row down so that rods fit tightly together, with little space between. Neighbors arrive carrying more bundles of hazel. Some bring younger children who learn the craft by mimicking your weaving motions. You show them how to keep the rods straight and how to tuck each end securely against the post. You point out that if any rod breaks or splits, it must be replaced before you apply daub. At midday, the lower half of the wall has neat rows of hazel, each row resting on the one below. The woven lattice now looks like a basket wall ready to hold the daub. Next, you prepare the daub mixture. Daub must fill the gaps between rods and create a smooth surface. You gather clay from a bank near the stream. The clay here feels sticky when wet and turns firm when dry. You and 2 neighbors collect wheelbarrows full of clay, carrying it to a spot on raised boards to avoid mud. You add water and begin to knead the clay with bare feet until it resembles thick dough. To this you add straw harvested during harvest time and long wisps of animal hair saved from last winter's shearing. You mix straw and hair into the clay, kneading until fibers distribute evenly. This mixture ensures the daub will dry strong and resist cracking when weather changes. You note that the clay must remain moist to apply easily. If it dries too soon, you will struggle to press it into the tight wattle. You work quickly, rolling handfuls of daub into rough cylinders and handing them to helpers at the wall. Taking a cylinder, you press the daub into the bottommost gaps in the wattle, filling each space until the rods disappear beneath the earthen coating. With each handful, you use the broad side of your hand to push the mixture firmly between rods, compacting it so no air pockets remain. As your hand works, clay and straw press into the lattice until the wall appears flat. Neighbors form a rhythm around you. One passes clay and daub from the mixing area up the ladder. Another stands on the ladder and applies daub to higher sections. A third brings fresh straw and hair to add to the mixing pile as needed. Children watch in fascination and occasionally help by dropping small sticks into the buckets to be used for muck trowels. Soon, The lower third of the wall stands covered in patched earthen coat. Between sections of the wall, you place small wooden guides so the surface remains even. These guides are lengths of straight sapling fixed temporarily across the wattle at chest height. You apply daub up to the guide, then use a flat wooden board to scrape excess clay away until the surface is flush with the guide. You repeat this across the entire face of the wall, sliding the board along its length to level the daub. Once one section cures and guides come down, you will fill the next layer and repeat leveling. As afternoon wears on, clouds gather and a light drizzle begins. You smile, knowing that gentle rain helps the daub settle and dry slowly without cracking. A heavy downpour, however, would wash the daub away before it dries. You and neighbors quickly cover the work with broad leaves until the rain subsides. Under the makeshift shelter, the thatched roof overhead drips rhythmically. After the rain slackens, you remove leaves and find the daub firm to the touch along its lower edge. You resume work, now able to press the daub higher without fear of mud sliding away. Soon the middle third of the wattle rises with daub. At times the mixture sticks to your hands in cold clumps, but as you push and smooth it becomes supple. You pay special attention around the window and door openings. There you leave intentional gaps for frames and lintels. Once the frames stand in place, you will apply daub around them and carve edges with a small trowel until the shape sits flush. You note how the clay naturally slopes away at the base of windows to form a drip edge that directs water away. Sunday sets, and you gather final handfuls to fill the top of the wall, pressing the last bits of daub into place. You step back to inspect your work. The wall stands solid and smooth, lacking only the final finish coat. Your neighbors nod in approval. Tomorrow you will apply a finer mixture of clay and straw to seal minor imperfections and create a uniform skin. You hand each helper a face, wooden mug boiled with ale, as thanks for labor. As dusk falls, you return the unused hazel rods to a dry location. Woven wattle left exposed might rot if damp. You store remaining rods in a loft nearby for patching small holes in winter. You sprinkle straw thatch around the base of the wall to collect excess moisture and protect the lower daub from erosion. The cottage frame now stands half enclosed. Each woven panel functions like a wall of natural wood and clay, ready to shelter from wind and sun. At the end of the day, you extinguish a small fire near the clearing. Neighbors light lanterns and gather around a fresh clay hearth you dug earlier inside the cottage. You roast bits of potatoes and roasted nuts over embers. The conversation drifts between tomorrow's tasks and memories of wattle walls from other villages. Someone recalls an old cottage that stood for 50 years with only a minor crack repaired each season. Their words give you confidence that your work today will last decades if well maintained. As night deepens, you rest upon a wooden bench beside the frame. The breeze rustles through the hazel rods above the daub layer, creating a quiet whisper. The structure feels alive with promise. You recall that tomorrow you must apply the final finish of daub and then let the walls cure fully before raising roof rafters. In this moment, the wattle and daub holds firm under your touch, a testament to skill and community effort. You close your eyes and breathe in the earthy scent of clay, straw, and fresh-cut wood. The cottage stands half-formed against the stars, awaiting final layers. You rise at dawn and stroll to the wetland edge, where clumps of reeds sway in the breeze. The reeds stand tall and straight, ideal for thatching. With a sharp sickle, you cut through thick bundles, taking care to leave roots intact so regrowth will follow next season. Each reed measures nearly 10 hands long and thick at its base. You gather arms full, tying them into bundles with lengths of twisted grass. These bundles will form the main thatch of the roof. You continue until you have more than 100 bundles, enough to cover the cottage in several layers. Back at the cottage frame, neighbors stand on ladders straddling rafter poles. You perch atop the central ridgepole to guide them, First, you lay the lower layers of reed bundles along the eaves. Each bundle overlaps the one below by several fingers to ensure rainwater will run off without seeping through. You hold a bundle against the rafter at the eave, its butt ends extending a span beyond the wall plate. Neighbors press the bundle into place and bind it to the rafter with lengths of woven hazel twine. They wrap the twine twice around the bundle and rafter, then tie a secure knot. With each tied bundle, the thatch layer grows thicker. You work systematically, moving along the eave so each bundle's head lies next to its neighbors, forming a uniform base layer. Once the lower eave layer stands firm, you step down a ladder and call for more bundles. Today, you will build up the thatch in horizontal tiers. Each tier must lie flush against the one below so water cannot slip beneath. You hand bundles to neighbors who press them downward as you wrap binding twine around rafters. Each tier sits 4 hands high before you move on to the next. You check regularly to confirm the slope remains even. The cottage pitch sits at a steep angle, nearly 45 degrees, to allow water to run off quickly. As midday sun warms the clearing, you break for water and small loaves of barley bread. Neighbors rest on ladder rungs or perch on roof beams. They chat quietly about tomorrow's tasks and the rain forecast for next week. You know that once the thatch dries slightly, it must stay dry through curing or risk mildew. You sip from a wooden cup and listen to the gentle rustle of reeds overhead. Afternoon brings fresh bundles of straw. These you harvested from the rye field weeks ago and stacked under cover. Straw thatch differs from reed in that it lies flatter and requires more bundles to create thickness. You begin a second section of roof where a small dormer will sit. Here straw works best to fit curving edges. You take a bundle of straw and fold it in half, then press the folded end into place atop the reed layer. Neighbors tie the straw with hemp twine against the rafter. Each bundle's folded end forms a neat rectangular profile that sheds water. After tying, you trim stray pieces with a small knife so each edge remains straight. When that section stands 2 tiers high in straw, you switch back to reed to form the main roof field. You and neighbors alternate rows until the entire roof lies uniformly thick. Reed forms the outer weather-resistant face, while straw underlies dormers and transitions. As you near the ridgepole at the top, you bind bundles more tightly so they will not shift in strong winds. You wrap thick cords of hazel around the ridgepole and the uppermost reed bundles, tying secure knots at intervals to prevent slippage. Now the roof stands complete, except for a smoke hole. You climb to the ridge and mark a small square opening directly above the future hearth. The smoke hole must align with the hearth's flue, so smoke can escape and not fill the cottage. Using a small knife, you cut through the thatch bundles, leaving a neat framed opening. You press aside cut reeds and straw until the underlying rafter grid appears. The smoke hole rests entirely on rafters, with space between rafters to fit a simple wooden frame later. Below, you hear neighbors clearing thatch debris from the ground. One child piles discarded ends of reed and straw to burn when the weather warms. You plan to reuse ash as fertilizer in the vegetable patch. As dusk approaches, you gather atop the roof near the smoke hole. You fasten a small frame of split oak around the opening. This frame forms a slight curb to support a clay cap later. The clay cap will deflect rain and keep out drifting snow. You press softened clay mixed with straw into corners, smoothing edges with your hands. You carve a small lip so water flows away from the opening. Next, you fashion a simple roof vent door. You carve a panel from a thin plank, roughly the size of the smoke hole. You attach it to a heavy willow hinge you fashioned yesterday. The hinge hangs from a peg driven into the ridgepole. You test the door by swing it closed and open. It fits snugly, sealing the smoke hole when latched. You carve a small handle from hazel and attach it with a leather thong so it can swing easily from inside. With that done, you step back to inspect your work. The thatch lies thick and uniform across the roof, its ridgeline clean and straight. The smoke hole sits neatly framed with clay and wood. You watch as last light glints off bound reed butts. The slope appears even and weather tight. A small breeze rustles the thatch, but no bundle moves. Rain would run off in torrents, carried away from walls by overhangs. Finally, you descend to ground level. Neighbors follow, climbing down ladders and brushing off debris. You wash your hands at a nearby bucket of clean water and share a simple evening meal of meat and turnips. As you eat, you discuss tomorrow's plan to apply clay and cow dung mixture over thatch near the ridge to seal spaces and improve weather resistance. Night settles, and you walk inside the half-finished cottage. The interior feels cool and dry despite thatch above. You climb onto the floor joists and remove your boots. You lie on a bed of straw near the future hearth. Moonlight filters through the smoke hole, illuminating particles of dust suspended in the air. You feel safe beneath the thick thatch and robust framework. You recall the morning's work in the reed marsh, an afternoon in binding thatch. Each bundle and each binding cord now works to protect your family from wind and rain. As you drift towards sleep, you hear the patter of bats outside and smell the faint scent of wet straw. The thatched roof stands as a testament to collective skill and patient craft, sheltering you through seasons yet to come. Doors and windows, and build the hearth and chimney inside the newly thatched cottage. First, you select sturdy oak for shutters. These shutters must fit snugly into rough-hewn window openings carved into the wattle and daub walls. You measure each opening carefully, using a small wooden square and a length of cord marked in local spans. You note one window sits near the north post and another on the south side. Both measure 4 hands across and 3 hands tall. At the edge of the clearing, you lay a plank across 2 sawhorses fashioned from split logs. With a sharpened adze and a wooden mallet, you hew the plank down to the correct width and thickness. The adze bites into the oak fibers and curls long shavings as you slice away excess. A neighbor holds the opposite end steady. When the plank lies flat and fair, you mark cut lines for the shutters. Each shutter will measure 2 hands wide by 3 hands tall. With a bow saw you cut along chalked lines, dust and splinters flying. You then carve a simple bevel around each panel's edge using a sharp carving knife, ensuring the shutter glides easily into its frame without splitting the daub. Next, you drill holes near the top and bottom of each. Shut a leaf with an awl, rotating it against a brace to spin the bit into the wood. These holes will accommodate leather straps that act as hinges. You cut strips of thick leather from tanned cowhide and soak them in water to make them pliable. You thread one end of a strap through a hole in the shutter, fix it with a wooden toggle, then drive the other end into the wall post beside the opening. The leather dries and tightens, pulling the shutter flush against the wattle. You repeat for the lower hinge. A simple wooden latch carved from willow twigs forms the shutter's catch, hooking into a notch cut into the post. You open and close the shutter to test the fit. Its movement remains smooth, despite the uneven wall surface. Next, you address the main door. You retrieve heavy oak logs split into rough boards the day before. 2 neighbors help you drag these boards to the front entrance. You lay them across a pair of trestles. With the adze, you flatten one face of each board, creating a smooth surface. You measure the doorway's width, 6 hands, and then mark hinge locations on the boards. Using an auger, you bore holes through thicker parts of the boards to accept wooden pins that form the hinges. These pins pass through holes in sturdy oak posts set into the ground as door jambs. You insert the first board into place, sliding wooden hinge pins through the matched holes. The board swings freely, albeit with a creak. You drive pegs into the jamb to secure each hinge pin. A second board joins beside the first, and you affix it similarly. Once both boards stand side by side, you carve a simple wooden latch on the inside, a rotating bar of oak that drops into a notch cut into the jamb. You carve a sliding bolt from a small branch to lock the door from within. Testing the door's swing, you confirm it closes snugly, sealing wind and cold. Meanwhile, at the rear, you prepare window frames. You fit ash boards across the opening, leaving a small gap 3 fingers wide between each board so a bit of light can filter even when closed. You carve thin cross slats from willow to brace the boards horizontally. Each slat slots into grooves chiseled at the window's edges. You drive wooden pegs through the grove of boards and slats to lock the frame together. You finish with shutters on the outside, now complete. With doors and windows in place, you turn inside to build the hearth. A small pit near the center of the floor awaits the hearth stones. You gather flat river stones from the nearby stream. Each stone must lie flush when arranged, forming a level surface for cooking fires. You carry stones in woven baskets, placing them around the fire pit. You arrange the stones in concentric circles, each layer slightly higher than the one above so smoke funnels upward. Neighbors bring more stones as you fill the pit's base. You then pack clay mixed with straw between stones, sealing gaps to prevent embers from falling into the earth. The clay cracks slightly as it settles, but you add more moistened clay to fill voids. You step on each stone to test for rocking. Any loose stone you replace or pack firmer. Next, you build the clay chimney above the hearth. You stack flat stones in a rough column, each sitting in a bed of clay. The stones taper as they rise, forming a narrow chimney flue. You place each layer slightly offset so water sheds as it drips down the outside. When the stone column reaches 2 hands above the roof's smoke hole, you cover its top with a flat slate stone to keep rain out. Around the chimney's base, where it meets the thatch, you carve a protective clay collar. You mix clay, straw, and crushed cow dung into a thick paste and press it around the base. This collar seals the meeting point between the thatch and chimney, preventing sparks from igniting straw. With the chimney secure, you finish the hearth by building a low clay apron in front of it. You pack clay mixed with small pebbles to form a curved lip for embers to dwell safely. This curve prevents sparks from landing in the cottage. Once dry, the clay hardens and becomes heat resistant. As afternoon wanes, you test the hearth by building a small fire atop the stone bed. With 2 kindling sticks from birch bark and dry twigs of hazel, you kindle a flame. Within moments, the fire crackles. Smoke rises through the clay-lined chimney, spiraling out into the open air. You inspect the smoke's path, ensuring it does not leak behind the chimney stones and seep into the thatch. You note a faint whiff of smoke inside and press clay into a small gap to seal it. The readjusted clay cures quickly by the fire's heat. By dusk, the hearth stands ready for cooking and warmth. You toss small sticks onto the cooling coals and extinguish them. Likewise, you extinguish the lantern hung near the door. The cottage now offers a stout door, functioning shutters, and a safe hearth that breathes smoke through its clay chimney. Neighbors gather to share a simple meal of lentil stew and flatbread cooked earlier on a cast-iron griddle. Around the hearth, flames once danced tonight meet only coals now cooling beneath ashes. You rest on a bench carved from oak and feel pride in each carved shutter, hinged door, and carefully stacked stones. Tomorrow, you will add finishing touches, plastering the window frames and sealing cracks with clay. But tonight, your family will sleep beneath a roof that keeps wind and rain, and a hearth that holds warmth and life. You enter the cottage, now framed by thatched roof and clay chimney, and stand on the rough floor where joists and boards wait to be finished. The walls of woven hazel and daub form a nastaves, sturdy enclosure, yet their interior surfaces appear uneven and raw. Today, you plan to plaster those walls with a fine layer of mud to smooth them and prepare them for daily life. You gather clay from the nearby bank mixed with straw and animal hair. The clay feels cool and sticky when you knead it with water until it reaches the consistency of thick porridge. Neighbors arrive, carrying baskets of render and fresh water. You spread a tarp of woven reeds on the floor to catch falling drips. First, you climb a ladder and smear clay onto the uppermost panels of wattle. With both hands, you press the clay into every gap among the rods until the surface lies even. Fingers glide over each mound as you smooth away ridges. You move down to lower sections until the entire wall interior stands covered with its first coat of plaster. Tiny cracks appear where the mud begins to dry in the midday sun. You step back and let the coat cure for a few hours. In the meantime, you tend to the floor. The floorboards feel coarse underfoot. You must fill the gaps and create a flat surface safer for daily chores. You carry a small trough of sand and clay mixture to the center. With a trowel fashioned from a splinter of oak, you spread a thin layer of sand and clay across the boards. Each smooth stroke fills cracks and levels uneven boards. You pause to rotate the trough and add water so the mixture retains its paste-like texture. As dusk approaches, the fine layer begins to firm. You step gingerly to test hardness. The floor now feels more solid and less likely to trap dirt. Tomorrow you will finish a final smoothing with a brush made from boar bristles. For now you focus on the second coat of interior plaster. Neighbors return bearing fresh mud. You climb back onto the ladder and apply a finer mixture that contains smaller particles of clay and no sand. The second coat goes on smoothly. You push the mud until the walls appear creamy and seamless. Each motion carries a faint scent of damp earth. A small group of children bring bundles of sheep wool and press fibers into the wet plaster to reinforce it. Their small hands giggle as wool strands slip beneath fingertips. Together, you press the wool into the clay so that the fibers hold the material against cracks once walls dry completely. Once the second coat covers all interior surfaces, you stand back. In the fading light, the walls glow pale and uniform. You notice several areas where clay peeled away from wattle during application. You fill those spots with quick strokes of plaster and scrape away excess with a flat wooden blade. Birds nest outside on the eaves, and their calls echo through the open doorway. As the walls cure overnight, you prepare furnishings. First, you craft rough benches for seating. You select stout planks of oak left over from framing. Each plank measures 4 hands in width and 8 hands in length. You lay a plank across 2 stumps, driven into the floor near the hearth, and mark legs directly beneath each corner. Using a hand saw, you cut 4 stubby legs each measuring 2 hands in length and 3 fingers thick. With a chisel and mallet, you shape mortise holes into the plank's underside where legs will insert. You carve matching tenons on each leg so they slide snugly into the mortises. Once you fit each leg into place, you drive a wooden peg through the tenon to lock it. You repeat for each bench and place them along walls where light from windows enters at midday. Next, you build a small table for food preparation. You shape 4 slender legs from ash saplings, split to yield smooth cylindrical posts. Measuring each leg to equal length ensures the table sits level. You carve simple mortises into a board to receive tenons on each leg. The board measures 6 hands long and 3 hands wide. You carve a shallow groove along its center, where a cutting board will sit later. After fitting legs and pegging them into place, you invest time smoothing the plank top with a draw knife. Each shaving removed reveals fresh wood grain beneath. Finally, you set the table near the hearth edge so cooking pots and utensils may rest upon it. For storage, you craft wall shelves. You select slender boards and carve triangular brackets from thicker oak scraps. Each bracket features a notch to cradle the shelf board. You fix brackets to the plastered wall by driving wooden pegs into the wattle behind the door while the mud is still damp to grip the peg. Once the plaster cures, the peg holds tight. You place boards onto brackets and now have shelves where earthenware jugs and woven baskets can sit off the floor. As night falls, you return to the softened walls. Your bristle brush stands ready. With both hands, you brush each wall section in smooth strokes from top to bottom. The bristles polish the surface, scraping away minor bumps and distributing fine clay particles evenly. After several passes, the walls shine faintly in the firelight. The interior feels more refined, though still humble. You rake stray clay chips into a pile beneath a window for tomorrow's mud brick patching. Finally, you prepare the hearth area for daily use. You rake embers from last night's fire and spread ash over a flat stone hearthbed to polish its surface. You select larger river stones and arrange them behind the hearthbed to form a low shelf. Neighbors bring clay to fill small voids between stones and press it firmly, creating a smooth flue path. You carve a shallow trench in the clay ahead of the hearth to channel heat and direct ash away. With interior now nearly complete, you dust straw across the floor to add warmth. You place a woven mat near the entry to catch dirt. In one corner, you hang a small woven rack for drying herbs and meat. Ready for furnishings, you place benches against the plastered walls and position the table near the hearth. As the moon rises, you gather neighbors for a final meal inside. The benches fill with warm bodies and laughter. You dip bread into soup simmering over embers and taste sweet marrow from carved wooden spoons. The plaster walls absorb the firelight glow, casting a golden hue over faces. You speak softly of tomorrow's plan to apply a final whitewash made from chalk and water to brighten walls. Children curl up on benches and drift to sleep beside the hearth, comforted by the glow and gentle heat. By midnight, the cottage stands as a testament to local craft and communal will. Walls of daub, now smooth and sealed, hold in warmth. The floor beneath is level and sturdy. Benches and table provide simple comfort. Above, the thatch roof shelters against wind and rain. Tomorrow, the final touches will complete the home. But tonight you rest content, knowing a family will soon dwell within, safe from elements and soothed by the homespun beauty of wattle, clay, and crafted furnishings. Early dawn finds the village stirring as neighbors gather for the workday. Word passed through. Simple wooden posts painted outside the manor gate reading, "Join in building the common barn today. Bring tools and strength." By sunrise, men and women gather near the clearing, each carrying implements, chisels, forks, spades, and hammers. Children trail behind, clutching, wooden buckets to ferry water and food. The reeve steps forward to explain the tasks. Some will haul beams, others weave thatch, and a group will collect fresh water for mixing daub. Everyone stands attentive, nodding in agreement. No one is paid in coin. Instead, each family owes a measure of labor once per season, forging ties that bind all to shared purpose. Tools clatter as neighbors move into place. The blacksmith sets to work sharpening axes, adzes so blades bite cleanly into timber. Women form lines to carry clay and straw to those. Weaving walls, old as well as young, pitch in, offering hands for heavy lifting or simple tasks. Each pair of arms helps erect frame or spread fresh thatch until midday sun presses hot against shoulders. The air hums with conversation, plans for next harvest gossip, about recent raids, and laughter teasing the smith's new apprentice. Even the shyest villagers find solace in shared toil, sweat mingled with song and friendly jests. At high noon, church bells toll, signaling break time. A table near the barn entrance groans under preserves and salted pork. The pork came from the common herd butchered weeks ago and cured in brine under supervision of the reeve. Neighbors bring jugs of ale brewed from last season's barley. A chorus of eager thanks rises as bread and cheese appear on rough boards. Children gather around benches, dipping meat into savory broth warmed over embers. Elders pass around mugs of ale, inviting all to toast the shared labor and blessings of good weather. A simple blessing is spoken by the parish priest. May this work lead to safety and prosperity for all. After the meal, the lively part of the feast begins. A fiddler appears from among the crowd, tuning his instrument. He bows a neighbor's daughter to step forward and dance. Others clap in rhythm as she twirls across the village green in a swirl of homespun skirts. Fathers lift toddlers overhead so they might glimpse the frolic. The festive mood carries the laborers through one more round of work, lifting heavy beams to set rafters and thatch the final ridge cap. Children chase one another around stacks of timber, their laughter echoing across the fields. As afternoon fades, neighbors gather again to remove tools and secure the site. The barn frame now stands firm and true. Women sweep straw dust from the floor while men check pegs in sturdy joints. All hands celebrate one last time with shared mugs of ale and handfuls of nuts, roasted over the smouldering hearth, still warm from midday cooking. Finally, as the sun sets behind distant woods, villagers disperse to cabins lit by small hearth fires. They return to families and beds, each heart light with satisfaction. In the days that follow, the barn will shelter grain and livestock, a testament to collective strength. But memories of that communal labor and festive feast linger long. Stories are told at winter gatherings about how neighbors joined hands and made laughter and sweat build more than a barn. They built community. When winter arrives, a hush falls over the fields, and the newly built cottage lies quiet beneath a cottage blanket of frost. The cold seeps into every crevice, rigid soil locking tools in place and halting construction until spring. You rise before dawn to tend livestock and stoke the hearth, but outside the landscape remains frozen. Even simple tasks like chopping wood become arduous as the iron axe bit struggles to bite into frozen logs. The earth beneath the cottage sills remains rock hard, unyielding to the spade when you attempt to dig for patching cracks. Mortar and clay cannot be mixed with ice-chilled water. Instead, they become brittle and fail to adhere. Neighbors gather in homesteads to share stories and preserve food, but building labor gives way to preparing for the lean months. In the warmth of the hearth, you plan for spring. You inspect the roof's thatch from indoors, noting where wind has loosened bundles and where rainwater pools against the edges. In early spring, when sap begins to rise in the trees and frost recedes from the ground, you gather tools and materials. You check axes for chips, resharpening their edges on whetstones until they slice through wood with ease. You test chisels by carving small wood blocks until their blades run smooth. With sharpened tools, you prepare to reopen tasks paused by winter. As the first thaw arrives and streams flow freely again, you step outside to survey repairs. The thatch that held firm beneath snow now shows spots where wind pierced bundles, leaving gaps that once wet clay now clings to daub beneath. You climb a ladder to the eaves, pulling new bundles of reed from last autumn's harvest. One by one, you bind reed to rafters, weaving each bundle into the existing layers. With nimble motions, you slide new twine around rafters to hold bundles tight. You test each section by pressing gently to ensure no loose spots remain. When winter arrives, a hush falls over the fields, and the newly built cottage lies quiet beneath a blanket of frost. The cold seeps into every crevice, rigid soil locking tools in place, and halting construction until spring. You rise before dawn to tend livestock and stoke the hearth, but outside the landscape remains frozen. Even simple tasks like chopping wood become arduous as the iron axe bit struggles to bite into frozen logs. The earth beneath the cottage sills remains rock hard, unyielding to the spade when you attempt to dig for patching cracks. Mortar and clay cannot be mixed with ice-chilled water. Instead, they become brittle and fail to adhere. Neighbors gather in homesteads to share stories and preserve food, but building labor gives way to preparing for the lean months. In the warmth of the hearth, you plan for spring. You inspect the roof's thatch from indoors, noting where wind has loosened bundles and where rainwater pools against the edges. In early spring, when sap begins to rise in the trees and frost recedes from the ground, you gather tools and materials. You check axes for chips, resharpening their edges on whetstones until they slice through wood with ease. You test chisels by carving small wood blocks until their blades run smooth. With sharpened tools, you prepare to reopen tasks paused by winter. As the first thaw arrives and streams flow freely again, you step outside to survey repairs. The thatch that held firm beneath snow now shows spots where wind pierced bundles, leaving gaps that once wet clay now clings to daub beneath. You climb a ladder to the eaves, pulling new bundles of reed from last autumn's harvest. One by one you bind reed to rafters, weaving each bundle into the existing layers. With nimble motions you slide new twine around rafters to hold bundles tight. You test each section by pressing gently to ensure no loose spots remain. Next you check wattle walls for cracks. Winter's cold can shrink clay and strain joints. You run your hand along interior plaster to feel uneven depressions. Where small fissures appear, you gather fresh clay and straw mixture. Kneeling on floor joists, you press the mud into cracks, smoothing until walls appear seamless. Outside during daylight, morning sun dries the patch so that peasants bringing children to tend goats glance at a smooth, uniform wall rather than random breaks. Floorboards settled over winter toward the ground. You walk inside to find gaps between planks where wind gusts squeeze through. With sand and clay mixture stored in a bucket, you pour into the gaps and press with a wooden scraper until level. You then spread fine ash on the floor to absorb moisture, returning with a broom the next day to sweep it away. The floor regains its firmness and remains more resistant to wear. The hearth that served throughout winter demands attention as well. You examine the clay and stone chimney, where smoke now stains the upper stones. You brush away soot and inspect joints, where heavy use loosened small stones. You pack fresh clay between stones, sealing gaps so that smoke will rise freely when you kindle the first fire of spring. You lay fresh firewood nearby to keep logs dry. Outside, roof thatch is at the height of its season for maintenance. With poles and ladders, you inspect ridgeline binding. Frost and thaw cycles can cause ties to loosen. You rewrap hazel, twine around the ridge beam, tightening to prevent wind from prying bundles. You carve new notches in reeds to fit under neighbors' hands as they weave bundles. Each motion brings thatch to greater resilience. Finally, you check wooden shutters and doors. Winter's frost can warp timber. You open and close each shutter, noting where the leather hinges creak as they dry. You oil the hinges with rendered animal fat to prevent cracking. You adjust wooden latches so they fit the door jamb snugly. In places where frost cracked boards, you replace them with newly split oak boards, fastening with wooden pegs. By the time spring's full warmth arrives, repairs complete, and the cottage stands ready. Its thatch no longer leaks. Walls hold tight without fissures. Floor feels firm underfoot, and hearth draws smoke cleanly. Once more you can invite neighbors for shared labor and meals. The cycle of seasonal constraint and renewal shapes every peasant's year. Even as summer sun heats the fields to harvest, you carry memory of winter's halt and spring's rebirth, ensuring your home endures through seasons yet to come. Imagine waking before the first light and lifting a heavy axe to fell ancient oak by hand. You know no power tools or machinery. Instead, your hands must guide every blow as the axe bit sinks into thick wood. The sharp steel edge bites through living fibers with a thunderous crack, but misplace a strike by a fraction and the blade glances off, risking injury. By midday, your muscles ache and sweat mingles with wood shavings. Back at the cottage frame, You strain every sinew to lift beams high enough to fit mortise and tenon joints carved by hand. A misplaced chisel blow could spoil serious work. Razor-sharp tools demand constant attention to. Avoid cuts that fester without modern medicine. After turning mortise into post and tenon into beam, you haul that beam into place with neighbors' help, lifting 8 hands high and sliding it into its slot. Each joint must sit true, or the entire structure leans and buckles. You balance on ladders swaying to light gusts. One wrong step, and you pitch onto hard ground or puncture a lung on a protruding peg. Day by day you weather blistering sun, cutting and tying thatch. Your fingers strain to weave. Reed bundles into thick overlapping layers. Reed fibers peel and scratch, each strand lodging beneath fingernail or tearing knuckles raw. Rain may wash away bundles not tied tightly, forcing you to start again. Wind can catch your work and tear holes in a half-completed roof. Each repair demands fresh bundles, more sweat, and longer hours. Once walls stand, you carry buckets of heavy clay mud mixed with straw and animal hair. Each bucket weighs nearly an adult's arm span in effort. You climb ladders to plaster interior walls and risk slipping as your boots drag clay lumps. The clay dries slowly or too quickly, creating fissures that beg a second coat. In mud and straw, you sweat and wrestle to produce smooth surfaces that repel wind and retain warmth. Winter brings entire months of stoppage. Ground freezes to the depth of a man's boot, and clay becomes useless. You spend cold mornings gathering wood for hearth fires, to thaw your joints before tending animals. Roof thatch cracks beneath snow's weight, needing repair as soon as thaw arrives. Sheltered inside your coat, you watch hours pass while mortise and tenon wait for warm weather. Spring arrives, and you must patch each leak and rebuild where frost split joints. You gather fresh mud and straw, mix and apply, then wait as sun tames the walls. Neighbors offer only brief respite, casks of ale and plates of barley porridge. Tomorrow the work resumes. Consider crafting windows. You carve wooden shutters and drill holes by hand to fit leather hinges. Each completed shutter must swing freely in its rough woven wall. Leave even a small gap and wind hisses inside, chilling the hearth. Carving and fitting takes days for each window. Finally, there is upkeep. Each season you inspect posts for rot at their clay-sealed bases. You repack earth and stone footings, shovel away mud from around sills, and re-level floor joists that sunk under damp weight. Each task is relentless. Through all this, there is little reward but shelter, and the knowledge that next generation stands. Here, building and maintaining each home demands strength you cannot fake. Tools lie always, at the ready, sharp or dull, and demand careful sharpening and care. A dull blade adds toil. A crooked beam demands extra effort to correct. The back-breaking labor, chore by chore, insists on cooperation. Neighbors must toil side by side, trading strength and shared knowledge. Alone, you would not raise a single beam, thatch a roof, or hold a wall up. You lean on every neighbor's effort and repay with your own. A slip in the circle means a collapsed ridge or broken board, and you cannot afford such failure. To live this life for even a single day demands muscles stronger than steel, patience deeper than rivers, and a willingness to face storms wielding simple hand tools. If you have never swung an axe in sun-drunk woods, or kneaded clay in winter's dark under candlelight, chances you would find the work too much, too relentless. Each drop of sweat matters. Each bundle of thatch is hard-earned, and each knotted beam binds you to a community whose very survival depends on every hand. You might stand beneath a modern roof and admire its perfection, but know that above your head lies countless hours of labor by peasants who carved beams and wove walls from reed and clay. If you believe you could endure a day as a medieval peasant builder, recall that every moment has tested body and spirit beyond modern ease. In that fire and sweat you learn humility, endurance, and the fierce value of community. In this world of sun hard at noon and heavy rains threatening your mud walls, you find that building and living here demands heart stronger than any axe steel and will unbreakable as tempered stone.